Hey guys, tonight we're going to pull back the curtain on a gruesome historical secret, a story that has never been fully told about one of the most powerful women in the world. We all know that Elizabeth I died, but few people know the real reason behind her horrifying death. Was it a natural illness, or was it the consequence of a deadly vanity? And what happened to the Queen's body after she drew her final breath? Historical records reveal chilling details about a terribly disfigured corpse, a secret autopsy, and a dark secret that had to be buried for centuries. So, before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. Please comment below to let me know where you're watching from and what time it is there. Now, dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. Picture yourself wandering through the hushed corridors of Whitehall Palace, long after midnight has waned, on the 24th of March in the year 1603. The torches fixed to the ancient stone walls sputter softly, their flames bending in the draught that sighs through the passage like a ghostly breath. You feel the hush of the palace pressing close, as though time itself has paused in solemn reverence for the moment that lies ahead. At the farthest end of the corridor, beneath a grand archway carved with Tudor roses, you glimpse the heavy curtains of a royal chamber, drawn tight against the gloom. Inside, Elizabeth I, Queen of England, Sovereign of Ireland, and exalted as the Virgin Queen of all Christendom, has just surrendered her final breath. In the muted glow of candlelight, the royal physicians stand in clustered silence, their gowns rustling like soft spectres as they exchange anxious glances. Each man grips his notes or medical implements, trembling with a mixture of dread and awe, for what they now approach is more than the still body of a monarch. It is a vessel of secrets so profound that they may yet reshape our understanding of Tudor court life, the perilous seduction of royal vanity, and the startling cost of preserving power through artifice. To grasp the depth of these revelations, we must return to the autumn of 1562, when Elizabeth was but 29 years of age, her reputation for poise and brilliance secure, and her countenance admired by ambassadors and envoys from all corners of Europe. It was then that smallpox, nature's indiscriminate scourge, struck her down. In that era, smallpox claimed nearly 30% of its victims, leaving the fortunate survivors disfigured, their faces marred by pockmarked scars. Contemporary dispatches from the Spanish ambassador, Alvaro de la Cuadra, record that Elizabeth was forced into seclusion for an extended convalescence, her visage hidden behind veils and curtains, ravaged by angry pustules and fever, so fierce it threatened her life. Yet contradictory whispers from within the court suggested otherwise. Some courtiers claimed the Queen emerged from her chamber almost untouched, her skin as smooth and unblemished as before. These diverging testimonies, born of the same year, echoing through the same hallways, hint at something far weightier than mere propaganda, as though a silent pact had been made to conceal whatever truth lay beneath her serene exterior. From that turning point onward, Elizabeth's relationship with cosmetics deepened into a near obsession. The palace ledgers began to bulge with orders for Venetian ceruse, the famed white lead powder prized for its ability to impart an otherworldly purity to the complexion. 11 months after her illness, the treasurer's accounts recorded a procurement of no fewer than £200 of ceruse, enough to supply not just a queen, but an entire duchy. Renaissance beauty manuals, now preserved in dimly lit libraries, instruct that the powder be applied daily, left to rest on the skin for days at a time to achieve the desired alabaster sheen. But what those same guides skirt around is the price paid by the wearer. Lead, absorbed through the pores, accumulates insidiously, lodging in bone and marrow, poisoning tissue long before outward symptoms appear. Yet ceruse was only one note in Elizabeth's elaborate regimen. She also adopted a lip stain crafted from cinnabar, a crimson pigment infused with mercury. Medical experts of our own age have since observed that the lip's delicate skin allows for rapid mercury absorption, transporting the heavy metal directly into the bloodstream. And each evening, as the court retreated into private galleries alive with candlelight and soft conversation, Elizabeth would embark upon her nightly ritual of makeup removal. She would don soft gloves and dip cotton soaked in a mixture of crushed eggshells, alum, and yet more mercury across her painted cheeks and lips. In effect, she subjected herself twice daily to a formidable chemical assault, first through vibrant pigment, then through the caustic process meant to erase it. Over the ensuing decades, the toll of this self-imposed experiment grew unmistakable. Portraits painted during the 70s and 80s hint at subtle shifts, a slight droop to the jaw, a weariness around the eyes. But it would be long before any courtier dared whisper of the blackened teeth and receding hairline that some envoys witnessed. For Elizabeth remained vigilant in preserving her public image, her portraits carefully staged, her court appearances choreographed with meticulous precision, every detail calibrated to project unassailable majesty. Now, as the physicians gingerly peel back layers of linen and fine velvet from her still form, they prepare to uncover the corporeal evidence of decades-long toxic exposure. They know that beneath the pale surface they may find not merely the remains of skin and bone, but a record written in lead and mercury, a chronicle of the hidden agony endured by a woman who, in her pursuit of power, surrendered her own body to the alchemy of poison. Beneath the hush of that chamber, the air seems to tremble with anticipation. And as you stand in the stillness, you realize that the truth awaiting discovery will echo far beyond these palace walls into the annals of history, where it will reshape the legend of Elizabeth I, casting her final act not as a surrender to mortality, but as a testament to the perilous price of perfection. In the soft twilight of the 1570s, whispers began to drift through the courts of Europe, carried on the heels of diplomats and envoys who dared speak aloud of unsettling changes in Her Majesty's visage. The Venetian ambassador, his dispatches penned in a tone quick with unease, recorded that Elizabeth's once lustrous teeth, long admired for their alabaster sheen, had succumbed to an alarming metamorphosis. First they yellowed, he observed, as though sunlit marble was stained by rain-soaked leaves. Then, in a darker turn that chilled even the most seasoned courtiers, they blackened to the hue of charred timber. To any physician of the age, such discoloration would have marked a textbook case of mercury poisoning. For Elizabeth's beloved cinnabar lip stain, celebrated in courtly circles for its vibrant vermilion glow harboured within its pigment, the very metal that, over time, can eat away at tooth enamel and bone alike. These reports reached English ears like distant thunder, yet in Whitehall they were met with polite silence, as though acknowledging them aloud might summon some malevolent force. Meanwhile, the ledgers of the royal wardrobe told their own, more clinical tale. A steady escalation in orders for ornate wigs, each one more elaborate than the last, woven from the finest Indian hair and lined with costly velvet to disguise what some feared was the irreversible loss of the Queen's own. By the close of the century, no fewer than 36 palliasses, 6 wigs to be worn in rotation, were carefully catalogued, their purchase rationalized as mere fashion, in an age that prized appearance above all else. But behind the velvet and pearls lay a grim reality. Elizabeth's scalp had been slowly stripped bare by the same mercury that tinted her lips. Each application of the red stain, a drop of poison corroding her follicles until not a single strand remained. Yet even this physical transformation paled beside the more subtle and more terrifying ravages of mercury and lead upon the mind. Late in that decade, Spanish ambassadors lodged confidential complaints of dark melancholia enveloping the Queen's demeanour. They related that she would stand, motionless and transfixed, before tapestries or blank stretches of plastered wall, her expression vacant, as though her consciousness drifted far beyond the confines of Whitehall's gilded chambers. In their private letters, these envoys speculated that the king's physician had prescribed tonics of theriac and daphnal to rouse her faculties, but to no lasting effect. Modern scholars, reflecting upon these accounts, note that chronic lead exposure, by then likely festering in her bones, and the cumulative assault of mercury can produce precisely such symptoms of profound depression, erratic mood swings, and cognitive fog that renders even the sharpest intellect sluggish and withdrawn. Still, the most poignant chapter in Elizabeth's decline did not unfold until the final days of her reign. In the late spring of 1599, Robert Devereux, the Earl of Essex, chanced upon the Queen in an unguarded moment, a discovery that would later find its way into private correspondence and, centuries afterward, into the annals of history. Unadorned by the customary mask of ceruse and bereft of her signature wigs, Elizabeth appeared to him as a figure laid bare, vulnerable and shockingly mortal. Essex's hand trembled as he recorded her scalp, smooth and unencumbered by the silken hairpieces so meticulously crafted to convey sovereign regality. He wrote of skin, creased with fine lines like parchment aged by fire and frost, where once only smooth, unblemished tissue had shown. His testimony, initially dismissed by courtiers eager to preserve the Queen's myth, gained solemn weight as the wardrobe accounts and other eyewitness letters aligned to confirm that the loss of hair was not a mere affectation, but a tragic consequence of poisoning that no amount of powder or false locks could conceal. Even this, however, was but a prologue to the most heart-rending silence in English regal history. In the waning days of Elizabeth's life, she found herself robbed of her voice, the very instrument that had rallied armies, quelled rebellions, and enraptured audiences from the ramparts of Tilbury to the galleries of Westminster. According to the solemn record kept by Robert Carey, the clerk of the council, the Queen was no longer able to utter a single word. Beside her deathbed, courtiers turned anxious glances to one another as she, the master of rhetoric and oration, traced a trembling circle in the air with her finger, a final imperious gesture to confirm James VI of Scotland as her heir. That silent crown drawn in mid-air was the last testament of a sovereign whose tongue had once been likened to a clarion call. Now it lay still, its music silenced by the very toxins she had embraced in her quest for eternal perfection. Thus, in that pale chamber where the doctors stood with bated breath, Elizabeth's story reached its sombre zenith. Her body, once a living symbol of majestic authority, had become a repository of lead and mercury, each element a covert ally to her ambition and the unseen adversary of her flesh. And her mind, once so quick-witted and sovereign of her realm, had been shadowed by a creeping melancholia, a cognitive eclipse brought on by the substances meant to sustain her image. When the last candle guttered and the hush of night embraced Whitehall, the Queen's final secret lay not in her state papers or her treasury, but etched in the very cells of her being, a tragic alchemy of beauty and poison, power and silence, that would echo through the corridors of history long after the candlelight had faded into memory. In the final days of her life, Elizabeth I clung to a single, unwavering conviction, that if she were ever to lie down, she would never rise again. It was a belief born of the fierce will that had carried her through decades on the throne, from the troubled years of her sister's reign to the glory of the Spanish Armada's defeat, and now into the frailty of mortality. Thus, in her private bedchamber at Whitehall, she remained upright, propped by velvet cushions and attended by her loyal ladies in waiting for a full 15 hours. Outside, the candle flames guttered in the draughty corridor. Inside, the hush of the room pressed upon every breath, punctuated only by the soft rustle of silk and the distant tolling of the palace bell to mark the passing hours. As the sun dipped below the horizon and stars sprinkled the London sky, Elizabeth's strength waned. Without warning, her knees buckled, and she sank to the plush carpet at her feet, her cerused cheeks and lacquered lips rendered still by shock. For 4 long days, she lay there, motionless, the cushions around her forming a makeshift sanctuary against the cold floor. Physicians hovered at her side, their remedies no more than whispers and gentle ministrations, broths sipped through dainty silver spoons, cool cloths pressed against fever-bright temples. The Queen's courtiers stood by in respectful silence, straining to catch any sign of life in her pale countenance. Yet even in this state of profound vulnerability, she remained the sovereign image of stoicism, as though still reigning over every heartbeat and breath. When, at last, the attendants dared to lift her onto her bed, a bier more than a place of rest, her final command echoed through the silent chamber. "I forbid the cutting of my bowels, for so have I willed." This pronouncement flew in the face of centuries of royal precedent, for the preservation of a monarch's entrails in a separate reliquary had been deemed essential to safeguard the sovereign's frame against the ravages of decay. Nevertheless, Robert Cecil, her chief counsellor, ever mindful of protocol and politics, set aside her wish. In the hushed crypt beneath the palace chapel, servants carried out the disembowelment, a grisly ritual that stripped away Elizabeth's last assertion of bodily autonomy. The air grew thick with the faintest aroma of balsam and myrrh, mingling with whispered prayers as the royal entrails were extracted and placed in a silken vestment for separate interment. Yet it was what followed that truly defied the conventions of an age when even kings and queens were claimed by rot within days. The embalming that ensued was nothing short of miraculous in its ambition to forestall mortality. Skilled anatomists and barbers of the court applied layer upon layer of perfumed unguents, oils infused with frankincense, storax, and other resins, rubbing each ointment deep into the queen's skin. They packed her body cavities with aromatic herbs and spices, sewn shut with silk thread that shimmered like threads of moonlight. Finally, they sealed her within a coffin lined thickly with zinc and lead, so airtight that no living creature, nor any hint of moisture, could penetrate its gleaming walls. For 3 weeks, the coffin rested in Whitehall's guarded chapel, its polished surface reflecting torchlight as though it were the very vessel of her immortal soul. Modern forensic experts, peering back across the centuries, regard this elaborate preservation not merely as a testament to royal grandeur, but as a calculated effort to entomb the biochemical evidence of Elizabeth's demise. They theorize that the same compounds lead from her cherished Venetian ceruse, mercury from the cinnabar that stained her lips, lingered within her flesh, sealed away to ensure that future examinations would find only a perfectly preserved corpse, unmarred by the toxic signature of her lavish beauty rituals. In essence, her embalming became a makeshift laboratory, freezing in place the very markers that might one day reveal how vanity had poisoned her body. On the day of her funeral, Westminster Abbey thronged with mourners garbed in sombre black. Pallbearers carried the leaden coffin along the hallowed nave, yet no one dared glimpse the Queen's unadorned face. Instead, perched atop the casket was a wooden effigy carved in lifelike detail. Draped in parliamentary robes and crowned with the orb and sceptre, it presented to the world a vision of Elizabeth as she had appeared in her prime, radiant, unscarred, untarnished by illness or age. The effigy's smooth cheeks, high forehead, and stately expression bore no hint of the Queen's hidden suffering. The taut, hollowed jaw where muscle had withered, the hairless head beneath its painted wig, the faint shadow beneath the eyes where melancholy had once held her gaze captive. Witnesses gasped as they filed past, struck by the uncanny realism of the figure, which seemed more a living portrait than a mere carved tribute. It was clear to all that this wooden proxy had been crafted to conceal the stark truth buried within the coffin below. The artisans had sculpted every contour with loving precision, each fold of velvet, each polished pearl, each slight tilt of the head, to project an image of eternal youth and majesty. This final illusion, more elaborate than any mask Elizabeth had ever staged in life, spoke volumes about the lengths to which her court would go to preserve her legend and to hide the evidence of her tragic end. And so the procession concluded. The effigy replaced the Queen herself, a perfect simulacrum standing guard over her secrets. As the Abbey's doors shut on the mourners, Elizabeth's corporeal remains lay in silent vigil, suspended between decay and preservation, locked away in lead and zinc, and protected by the lifelike smile of a wooden effigy that would outlast flesh and bone. In that hushed moment, the boundary between reality and artifice blurred, and the Virgin Queen's final testament was written not in ink, but in the silent promise of eternal concealment. Thus ended the pageant of her death. A sovereign who, even in relinquishing life, strove to control every detail of her own legend, ensuring that the body she had inhabited would reveal nothing of the poison she had embraced in pursuit of an image beyond time. Elizabeth Southwell, once a maid of honour in the Queen's intimate household, left behind a singular and startling testament to Elizabeth's final state. According to her later recollections tarnished by the scandal of her conversion away from the Church of England, Elizabeth's corpse had become so saturated with noxious vapours that it purportedly exploded within its zinc-lined coffin. She described hearing a sudden crack, as though some hidden pressure had split the wooden casing and torn the velvet upholstery. Though many contemporaries dismissed Southwell's account as the ramblings of a discredited witness, modern forensic science has demonstrated that cadavers burdened with heavy metal poisoning, especially lead and mercury, can produce unusual gases during decomposition. As bacteria feast on the preserved tissues, chemical reactions can give rise to fermentation-like processes generating pockets of gas that, in a sealed environment, build up immense pressure. While the legend of the exploding coffin may be apocryphal in its dramatic flourish, the very persistence of such stories speaks to an acute awareness among Elizabeth's attendants that something was gravely amiss within her once regal form. In recent decades, the television series Royal Autopsy sought to peel back the layers of myth by reconstructing Elizabeth's final illness through the prism of surviving medical records. Drawing upon the notes of court physicians, private correspondences, and the scant fragments of Elizabeth's personal physician's journal, the forensic team simulated her condition in meticulous detail. They detected signs consistent with chronic throat infections, possibly scrofular or streptococcal abscesses, left untreated under the guise of noble stoicism. Her teeth, they noted, were described as severely eroded and discolored, matching the hallmark appearance of mercury necrosis and lead staining. Internal organs, as mapped from period autopsy sketches, appeared fibrotic and shrunken, a testament to decades of sustained chemical assault and the compounding effects of repeated bouts of pneumonia or bronchial congestion. The contemporary conclusion: while a respiratory infection likely precipitated the final collapse of her vital functions, the underlying, cumulative toll of heavy metals had so compromised her immune system that any hope of recovery had long since slipped away. Yet despite these clues, Elizabeth's remains have never been subjected to modern scientific scrutiny. Her tomb in Westminster Abbey, relocated in the year 1606 to the Lady Chapel at the behest of James I, remains sealed to this day. Only once, during the Victorian era, did Arthur Penrhyn Stanley, the Dean of Westminster, report a brief glimpse of the leaden sarcophagus. He recorded finding a coffin carved with the Tudor rose and bearing the initials E.R. beneath a knot of red velvet that had withstood centuries of decay. Contemporary accounts suggest that the lead casing was exceptionally thick, nearly twice the standard gauge used for royal interment, hinting at a deliberate attempt to preserve the Queen's remains in as pristine a state as possible. This ornate construction, combined with the elaborate embalming protocol, offers tantalizing evidence that those who arranged Elizabeth's funeral were intent on safeguarding not only her outward majesty, but also the toxic legacy hidden within her tissues. For historians and forensic experts alike, the inaccessibility of Elizabeth's final resting place presents both a profound frustration and a testament to her enduring power, even in death. The lead-lined coffin, sealed with wax and veiled by centuries of tradition, holds within it the chemical records of a queen's devotion to appearance at the expense of health. DNA analysis, heavy metal assays, bone density examinations, and even the identification of last meal residues, these modern methodologies could, in theory, yield definitive answers about the true causes of her demise. Yet each attempt to peer into the tomb is rebuffed by ecclesiastical decree and the weight of royal protocol. The Abbey authorities maintain that no sanctioned opening has ever taken place since the 16th century relocation, and any plea for scientific inquiry must reckon with the sacrosanct nature of the Queen's grave. And so the coffin remains a silent sentinel of Elizabeth I's paradoxical legacy, a vessel of both veneration and concealment. It stands as a monument to a monarch whose life was defined by the careful crafting of image, by the relentless pursuit of a timeless facade, and by the unacceptable extremes to which she went to preserve that illusion. Beneath the decorative effigy and the vaulted arch of Westminster's stone ceiling, the leaden walls of her coffin guard not only the physical remnants of her reign, but also the untold story of how a pursuit of beauty and power can sear itself into flesh and bone. The legend of an exploding coffin, the simulated findings of royal autopsy, and the stubborn sealing of her sarcophagus all converge to form a narrative as somber as it is fascinating. A final chapter in the life of a queen who, more than 4 centuries later, still wields sovereign authority over the boundary between myth and truth. In recent years, a careful re-examination of the evidence surrounding Elizabeth's final years has prompted spirited debate among historians. 2 scholars in particular, Anna Riviere and Kate Mulby, have cast doubt on the oft-repeated narrative of Elizabeth's reliance upon Venetian ceruse to the point of self-poisoning. They argue that many accounts of the Queen's white lead obsession sprang from Victorian sensationalism, a period when historians were all too eager to depict the Tudors as embodiments of excess and decay. According to Riviere and Mulby, the sources upon which this narrative rests court gossip, recorded decades after Elizabeth's death, dramatized memoirs, and medical treatises, citing long-vanished manuscripts, may have been coloured by the prejudices of a later age. They suggest that the volume of ceruse recorded in the royal accounts reflected not only the Queen's personal use, but also the demands of an entire court that prized a flawless complexion as a symbol of divine favour. In their view, it is quite possible that the actual quantities Elizabeth applied were far more moderate than legend would have us believe. Yet not all historians share this revisionist stance. A number of respected scholars have proposed that a severe bout of pneumonia recorded in court physicians' notes in the year 1598 was in fact the primary culprit behind her decline. They point to detailed entries describing high fevers, coughing fits, and laboured breathing consistent with a respiratory infection that modern clinicians recognise as life-threatening. In this interpretation, Elizabeth's cosmetic regimen played at most a supporting role, perhaps impeding genuine medical care by masking symptoms beneath layers of lead-based makeup. However, the majority of researchers still find the consistency of contemporaneous accounts, from ambassadors' dispatches to private letters, too compelling to dismiss entirely. These documents, spanning several decades and emanating from observers loyal and foreign, articulate a pattern of physical and mental distress that aligns strikingly with what we know of chronic heavy metal exposure. Central to the mystery is Elizabeth's explicit prohibition against any post-mortem examination. In an era when sovereigns routinely permitted or even mandated public autopsies to demonstrate transparency and divine continuity, the Queen's refusal stands out as a glaring anomaly. Privy Council records and the minutes of the State Council meetings underscore her obsession with controlling every facet of her public image. From the sumptuous gowns she wore, embroidered with Tudor roses, and sewn to accentuate her posture to the staged portraits painted at court studios, Elizabeth exerted meticulous oversight over how she would be remembered. Such measures extended beyond mere vanity. They functioned as a bulwark against political intrigue, for a monarch's authority was inseparable from the perception of her perennial vigour. Viewed through this lens, Elizabeth emerges as one of history's earliest practitioners of what might be called toxic cosmetic experimentation. Her use of Venetian ceruse and cinnabar-based lip stains offered more than temporary concealment of scars and wrinkles. They introduced potent neurotoxins into her system. Mercury, absorbed through the lips, interferes with nerve function, potentially inducing tremors, cognitive disturbances, and mood swings. Lead, readily taken up through the skin, accumulates in bones and marrow, undermining immune response and causing anemia, joint pain, and organ damage. By layering her face in these compounds day after day, Elizabeth effectively turned her own body into a laboratory for prolonged exposure, all in service of a facade of unblemished beauty. As if this were not enough, the political context of the late Tudor succession heightened the stakes for concealment. With no direct heir produced by Elizabeth, despite decades of careful statecraft and diplomatic manoeuvring, the question of the crown's future loomed large. James Stuart, King of Scotland, awaited his invitation, yet any blemish upon the Virgin Queen risked undermining the legitimacy of his accession. In this light, the elaborate funeral rites and the lifelike wooden effigy carved to resemble Elizabeth in her prime were more than acts of homage. They formed the final cover, a ceremonial screen to protect the integrity of the Tudor legacy. The effigy, draped in pall and crown, presented to the assembled mourners an image of unscarred majesty, even as the Queen's actual body lay hidden within layers of lead and zinc, its true state locked away from prying eyes. Thus, the violent intersection of cosmetics and politics shaped Elizabeth's final chapter. In her steadfast refusal of dissection, in the frantic pace of her image control strategies, and in the veiled processes that prepared her for interment, we see a ruler who understood the symbolic power of the body as both vessel and stage. The question remains, was Elizabeth a tragic pioneer in a self-poisoning ritual born of vanity, or was she a victim of misinterpreted maladies and overheated historical recollections? The debate endures like the quiet corridors of Whitehall at night, dimly lit, echoing with whispers of power, endurance, and the heavy price exacted by the pursuit of perfection. In the soft glow of modern scholarship, the question of Elizabeth's use of toxic cosmetics has been quietly upended by the careful work of Anna Rivale and Kate Molby. Rivale and Molby suggest that the oft-repeated tale of the Queen's obsessive reliance on Venetian ceruse, a powder composed largely of white lead, may be more myth than fact. They trace the origins of this narrative to Victorian historians, whose fascination with Tudor extravagance led them to read excessive consumption into every mention of ceruse in the royal accounts. In their analysis, the surviving account books, reflect not only Elizabeth's personal needs, but also those of her entire household, for powdered complexions were a mark of courtly refinement. Thus, they caution against accepting wholesale the notion that the Queen subjected herself to near-fatal levels of lead simply to maintain her pallid sheen. At the same time, other historians have turned their attention to a potentially more prosaic culprit in Elizabeth's final decline: pneumonia. Detailed notes from court physicians in the year 1598 describe bouts of violent coughing, high fevers, and laboured breathing symptoms more readily attributable to a severe respiratory infection than to chronic heavy metal toxicity. In this view, the Queen's cosmetic practices, though perhaps part of her self-presentation, served only to obscure the early signs of genuine illness, delaying effective intervention until the outbreak had progressed too far. Yet these reparative interpretations, while plausible, cannot wholly dismiss the consistency with which contemporary ambassadors, servants and secretaries recorded signs consistent with lead and mercury poisoning. Despite these divergent theories, one fact remains beyond dispute. Elizabeth I steadfastly forbade any post-mortem examination of her body. In an era when monarchs routinely permitted public autopsies to confirm divine continuity and reassure subjects, her refusal was extraordinary. Privy Council registers and minutes from the State Council emphasize her personal decree, enforced by her closest attendants. No lever, no hinge upon the sealed coffin was to be disturbed. This singular act of prohibition cast a veil of silence over whatever truths lay hidden in her tissues and set the stage for centuries of speculation. It begs the question, what did those loyal to her fear might emerge if the Queen's secrets were laid bare? The meticulous management of Elizabeth's image extended far beyond her deathbed. During her reign, court artists were instructed to portray her in carefully chosen three-quarter poses that minimized lines and softened the contours of her face. Portraits dispatched to foreign courts accentuated her high forehead and aristocratic bearing, diverting attention from any shadow of disfigurement that might betray the ravages of age or illness. In public ceremonies, the placement of torches and the construction of raised platforms ensured that spectators' eyes were drawn upward to her crown, rather than down toward her gloved hands or the subtle quivers of her jaw. Every aspect of staging, from the flow of her velvet trains to the rustle of her ermine sleeves, was choreographed to present an unassailable icon of majesty. Viewed through this lens, Elizabeth emerges as perhaps the earliest documented subject of what might be called self-imposed cosmetic experimentation. Her willingness to overlay her natural features with ceruse and cinnabar stains, even at the risk of bodily harm, testifies to a regime of self-poisoning undertaken in the service of political power. And she was far from alone. Diplomatic correspondence from the courts of France and Spain recounts similar practices among noble women, whose powdered faces and painted lips concealed the onset of tremors, dental decay, and early senescence. These foreign reports, written for private consumption within royal archives, lend credence to the notion that toxic makeup was a widespread, if deadly, secret formula for preserving youth and status. In the fraught days before her death, with no direct heir to secure the Tudor succession, the imperative to protect Elizabeth's Virgin Queen image reached its zenith. After her passing, James Stuart promptly ordered her remains moved to the Lady Chapel at Westminster Abbey and commanded the tomb to be sealed indefinitely. This relocation, undertaken within a matter of months, was framed as an act of filial piety, yet it also served to forestall any attempt to revisit the question of her true cause of death. The lead-lined coffin and its thick, inscribed slab became a political artifact as much as a funerary vessel, guarding the physical legacy of Elizabeth's reign against the prying scalpel of inquiry. Thus, the intertwining threads of scholarship, statecraft, and self-fashioning weave together to form Elizabeth's enduring mystery. Whether the Queen's health was undone chiefly by pneumonia or by a decades-long regimen of lead and mercury, her deliberate control over the narrative both in life and in death ensured that the line between truth and artifice would blur. In the centuries that followed, her sealed tomb and the legend of a poisoned beauty have inspired both awe and skepticism, reminding us that the body of a monarch can be a canvas for power, a laboratory for experiment, and above all, a vault of secrets too potent to reveal. In the hushed annals of Westminster Abbey, the story of Elizabeth I's final resting place is cloaked in as much secrecy as her own life. Atop her sealed coffin sits a wooden effigy, carved with astonishing realism, a lifelike simulacrum of the Queen in her prime, with delicate cheekbones, a high forehead, and the faintest curve of a knowing smile. To the crowds filing past, it appeared as if Elizabeth herself had been captured in wood, immortalized in vivid detail. Yet beneath that veneer of royal splendor lay a far more formidable vessel, a thick, lead-lined coffin concealed beneath layers of red velvet. Commissioned months before the Queen's death, this coffin's design speaks to an urgency to preserve and to hide her mortal remains with painstaking thoroughness. Guild records from the Worshipful Company of Carpenters reveal that Thomas Whitmore, master carpenter of the Guild, was entrusted with an extraordinary task. According to his personal journal, which lay buried in the Guild archives for centuries, Whitmore was instructed to reinforce the coffin's lid, create airtight compartments, and line the interior with lead, nearly twice the standard thickness used for royal interments. In his private reflections, Whitmore confessed to a sense of dread, noting that these specifications went far beyond customary funerary practice. He wrote that the unspoken purpose seemed less about honouring a sovereign's remains than about containing something terrible beyond simple decay, as though the coffin were designed to imprison not merely flesh and bone, but a dangereux secret. Centuries later, during the Victorian era, Dean Arthur Penrhyn Stanley of Westminster made a rare intrusion into the royal crypt. His published account describes the moment he peeled back part of the tomb's stone slab and glimpsed a coffin still wrapped in crimson velvet. The initials E.R. and a Tudor rose were carved into the lead casing, though the wood beneath had all but rotted away. Among the few artifacts Stanley recorded were medical instruments and glass vials, likely remnants of embalming mixtures rich in mercury and other preservatives. According to his private correspondence, these items were never catalogued by the Abbey and vanished without trace after his departure, fueling speculation that someone had spirited them away to prevent further scrutiny. In the 20th century, attempts to re-examine Elizabeth's sarcophagus met with equally mysterious obstruction. Historians document at least 2 unannounced inspections by Abbey authorities in 1953 and again in 1978, where teams equipped to sample the Queen's remains were rebuffed at every turn. They encountered nothing but that impenetrable shell of lead, and the promised relics of embalming fluid and metal-laden swabs eluded them entirely. These thwarted efforts only deepened the suspicion of deliberate tampering. Did someone intentionally remove or destroy forensic evidence? Victorian-era agendas to sanitize the royal narrative, as noted by researcher James Whitfield, involved the systematic suppression of inconvenient records. It seems plausible that Whitmore's instruments, Stanley's vials, and even delicate parchments detailing embalming proportions were quietly erased in a coordinated campaign to seal Elizabeth's secrets forever. Beyond the walls of England, diplomatic dispatches offer a contrasting and often more candid perspective on the Queen's condition. Spanish and French ambassadors, writing to their sovereigns in confidential letters, described Elizabeth's protracted make-up rituals, hours spent layering ceruse and cinnabar, her sallow hands stained with residue, and the trembling of her fingers during final audience sessions. These accounts, intended for internal use, carried no obligation to flatter or to uphold Tudor myth. Their unvarnished tone lends them a weight of objectivity largely absent from English court histories, which had every reason to preserve the image of an unassailable monarch. Even within the State Council's private minutes, there are glimpses of panic over Elizabeth's failing health. Councillors debated abbreviated ceremonial processions, offered contingencies to shorten the coronation of James Stuart, and discussed employing body doubles for public appearances should the Queen's strength falter. These notes, rediscovered in a fortuitous archive find, attest to a court scrambling to maintain appearances even as clandestine cholera-like fevers, or perhaps the cumulative effects of heavy metals, undermined the Queen's vitality. The practice of substituting lookalikes in public was an extraordinary measure, one more commonly associated with high-risk espionage than with monarchical pageantry. Yet for Elizabeth, it became a temporary bulwark against the forces that would expose her frail flesh and wavering voice to the world. In weaving together these threads, the carpentry orders that doubled lead thickness, the vanished embalming tools, the sealed inspections, and the foreign envoy's unguarded testimonies, we glimpse a complex tapestry of power, deception, and mortality. Elizabeth's corpse, sealed in a coffin designed to stifle both decay and discovery, became a silent collaborator in her own myth-making. The very measures taken to preserve her body served equally to obscure the truth of what lay within. And as carved roses and velvet swathes mask the weighty lid, we are reminded that in the corridors of history, the boundary between preservation and concealment is all too thin, leaving us to wonder what truly rests beneath Elizabeth I's leaden tomb. The story of the body doubles pressed the boundaries of what we imagine possible at the Tudor court. Courtyard records, preserved in the royal archives, reveal that at least 3 women were meticulously selected and rigorously trained to stand in for Her Majesty during public ceremonies. These pretenders were chosen for their similar height and build, each required to mirror the Queen's slender posture and stately gait. They were schooled in Elizabeth's distinctive mannerisms, the graceful tilt of her chin, the soft lilt of her carefully measured greeting, and even the precise inflection she employed when addressing her Privy Council. As Elizabeth's health faltered, these doubles rotated in and out of courtly audiences, shielded by layers of attendants whose sole purpose was to prevent any well-wisher from glimpsing the real sovereign in moments of frailty. Each appearance was an act of theatre more elaborate than the last. Nobles and foreign dignitaries, assembled in the Painted Hall of Whitehall or the Grand Chamber of Hampton Court, saw only the familiar figure draped in purple and ermine, never suspecting that the woman beneath the crown on this day might be one of the well-drilled substitutes. Intricate patterns of bodyguards moved in shifts, creating a protective ring around the Queen's person. Their vigilant watch ensured that no courier or courtier could slip in close enough to witness the tremor in a double's hand, or the slight misplacement of a glove that might hint at the artifice. In the hushed corridors, whispers of confusion sometimes followed. A diplomat might note in his dispatch that the Queen's voice sounded oddly thin, or that her eyes seemed less animated. Yet the double's training was so exacting that most observers chalked these anomalies up to fatigue or the solemn mood of state business. Equally extraordinary were the paintings commissioned to immortalize Elizabeth's likeness. The court's official portrait workshops perfected a technique that blended cosmetics and paint into an almost alchemical medium. Painters like Nicholas Hilliard applied white lead not only as a cosmetic underlayer, but also as the very pigment in their oil paints, yielding a velvety, flawless canvas upon which they worked. These portraits, often executed from memory or based on earlier sittings, depicted Elizabeth as eternally youthful. In restoration reports compiled by Hilliard himself, now housed in a faded volume of workshop notes, it is recorded that lead-based pigments were preferred for their opacity and smooth finish. The more lead in the paint, the less visible any lines or blemishes, creating an enduring illusion of unwrinkled skin. It is perhaps the greatest irony that this same substance, white lead, was the very agent of her physical undoing, even as it revived her image. Lead, after all, is a potent neurotoxin, its particles infiltrating tissues and accumulating in bone over time. Each application of ceruse, every stroke of the brush that smoothed her portrait, contributed invisibly to a growing poison archive within her body. Elizabeth, intent on maintaining an image of perfection, unwittingly wielded an invisible weapon against her own health. In effect, she turned lead into both shield and sword, a tool to guard her authority through appearance, and a silent killer corroding her from within. Among the scattered relics that survived centuries of upheaval is the personal medical journal of her physician William Gilbert. Hidden in a secret cavity within his London townhouse, and recovered only during a renovation in 1998, Gilbert's notes chronicle a tragic progression of illness. He began with entries on minute pustules and facial eruptions that he treated with gentle salves. Over months, the journal shifts in tone. Passages grow terse as Gilbert records sharp pains in the ribs, then laboured respiration, and ultimately systemic debility. His final entries speak of joint deterioration so severe that Elizabeth could scarcely lift a quill to sign her name. The handwriting becomes erratic, the pages stained with what appears to be lead residue from his own contact with the Queen's treatments. Yet the wounds upon Elizabeth's spirit prove just as deep as those upon her flesh. Gilbert's sensitive observations note episodes of what he termed melancholic frenzy, during which the Queen would refuse all sustenance and withdraw into prolonged silence. Modern psychologists, reviewing these descriptions, diagnose a severe depressive disorder, possibly compounded by psychosis linked to heavy metal neuropathy. A woman of unshakable composure now struggled with paralyzing self-doubt. Her confidence eroded alongside her tissues. Each dawn she spent up to 6 hours applying her elaborate makeup, thick layers of ceruse and cinnabar, hoping to conceal the ravages of her condition. This ritual consumed her mornings, dictating the schedule of the entire court, delaying audiences, and often leading to the cancellation of state business. In these final passages of Gilbert's journal, we glimpse the full scope of Elizabeth's self-imposed experiment. A sovereign who sacrificed health for image, who marshaled the resources of an entire kingdom to support her facade, and who in turn allowed her body and mind to be ravaged by the very substances meant to preserve her. It is a somber testament to a life lived in the relentless pursuit of perfection, a pursuit that left her both idolized by her subjects and tragically alone in her private torment. And so, even as we admire her portraits hanging in hallowed galleries, we can recall the hidden narrative beneath the canvas, the story of a queen, and the chemical bonds that both defined and ultimately destroyed her. In the final pages of William Gilbert's private journal, we find the most poignant evidence of Elizabeth's tragic decline. His meticulous entries recount the Queen's gradual loss of speech. Once the master orator whose words could rally armies and soothe rival courts, she became increasingly unable to form a single syllable. Gilbert notes how, during her last days, she would lift her slender finger and trace a circle in the air, the silent emblem of a crown to confirm James VI of Scotland as her successor. Far more than a regal flourish, this simple gesture stood as testament to the severe motor dysfunction inflicted by the very toxins she had welcomed into her own flesh. As lead and mercury crept into her nervous system, her vocal muscles faltered. The Queen, famed for her golden speech, found herself reduced to a pantomime of regal authority. After her passing, those who witnessed her corpse described it as akin to a wax effigy. The skin lay unnaturally taut, almost translucent, as though the body had been transformed into living stone. This bizarre preservation was no accident of environment, but rather the cumulative result of centuries-old cosmetics and embalming concoctions that had, over decades, formed a chemical shell around her flesh. Each application of Venetian ceruse, rich in white lead, and each smear of cinnabar-based lip stain had seeped into her pores, building up layers of toxic preservation that, when combined with the balsamic embalming fluids applied at her funeral, arrested the normal processes of decay. Thus, rather than returning swiftly to earth, Elizabeth's body lingered on, held in stasis by its own vanity. This chemical embalming, Gilbert surmised in his final reflections, was a double-edged sword. On one hand, it arrested decomposition, allowing mourners to gaze upon a visage of eternal youth. On the other, it concealed the evidence of the suffering within. Tales of a sudden pop emanating from within her lead-lined coffin, an account first whispered by Elizabeth Southwell and later echoed in hushed corridors, gain plausibility when one considers the gas build-up that can occur in a sealed, toxin-laden chamber. Bacterial action on chemically preserved tissues can produce pockets of gas, and in the confined space of a zinc and lead sarcophagus, these pockets may burst forth with enough force to fracture wood and velvet coverings. Yet beyond the physical marvels, it was Elizabeth's final breath that Gilbert found most telling. In a note dated toward the end of his entries, he described her last exhalation as strangely peaceful, a gentle surrender to quiet that stood in stark contrast to the tumultuous drama of her reign. For 35 years she had navigated intrigue, war, and the relentless demands of sovereignty. In that final moment, she seemed to slip free of the gilded cage her image had become. In his closing lines, Gilbert confessed that he had come to view her death not as tragedy alone, but as release from the ceaseless performance, the painstaking makeup rituals, and the unending gaze of courtiers weighing her every gesture. Reflecting upon Elizabeth's life, we see how power and public image can coalesce into bonds as binding as any manacle. Her devotion to appearance, a commitment born of political necessity, as much as personal pride, ultimately became the very mechanism of her undoing. She poured white lead onto her skin to disguise the ravages of smallpox. She painted her lips with mercury, laced stains to uphold a visage of youthful splendor. She replayed the same elaborate rituals each dawn, shaping her routine and her court around the time-consuming pageantry of concealment. And in so doing, she wove a cocoon of vanity that sheltered her authority, while slowly poisoning her body and mind. In the centuries since her passing, historians and forensic scientists have grappled with her paradoxical legacy. Some emphasize pneumonia, others underscore chronic heavy metal exposure, Yet all agree that her final silence, both literal and metaphorical, speaks eloquently of the solitary path she trod. Elizabeth's story stands as a cautionary fable, that the pursuit of perfection can become a perilous trap, imprisoning even the most formidable individuals in a relentless cycle of self-preservation and degradation. In the hush of history, her echo lingers, a queen whose greatest performance was the life she sculpted upon her flesh, and whose most profound act was the quiet release of a poisoned breath. In the final months of her reign, Elizabeth's dedication to concealing every blemish grew into an almost ritualistic extremity. According to her personal physician, William Gilbert, each dawn found the Queen ensconced in her private chamber for no fewer than 6 hours, meticulously layering Venetian ceruse and cinnabar lip stain upon her pale skin. This daily regimen, intended to produce that milky, youthful countenance for which she was famed, became something far more macabre, a form of living embalming that saturated her flesh with microscopic crystals of lead and mercury. Over time, these heavy metals crystallized within her tissues, forming a chemical shell that arrested decay, even as it slowly ravaged her health from within. Gilbert's notes reveal that alongside this obsessive cosmetic routine, her physicians prescribed an array of contemporary blood-cleansing remedies. They mixed herbal tinctures, infusions of foxglove and juniper with wine to thin her blood, and powdered alum to act as a general astringent. These formulations, recorded in Gilbert's slender medical ledger, offered only fleeting reprieve. While Elizabeth might experience momentary clarity or a brief easing of joint pain, the underlying scourge of chronic heavy metal poisoning remained unchecked. His entries grow increasingly somber as he documents her descent into what he termed nervous debility, episodes of profound melancholia in which she would retreat into isolation, refusing sustenance and shutting out even her most trusted attendants for days on end. Psychologically, Elizabeth became ever more captive to her own carefully crafted image. Each time she glimpsed a reflection or caught sight of herself in a polished mirror, the fear of revealing a single flaw drove her to apply yet another layer of ceruse. This compulsion transformed her into a solitary figure, rarely seen without at least one attendant fanning a sheer silk screen before her, obscuring her features until the final henna-painted veneer was deemed sufficient. Court documents note frequent postponements of audiences, sudden cancellations of public appearances, and carefully timed revealings, in which Elizabeth's entrance was choreographed to catch the light at just the right angle, minimizing any evidence of facial lines or tremors. By this point, Elizabeth's court life resembled a scientific experiment more than royal ceremony. Internal correspondence among her advisors, preserved in ciphered missives, details plans for rotating a team of interpreters who would stand just inside the privy chamber, relaying the Queen's slurred or halting utterances to those assembled beyond. This measure was designed to mask the telltale signs of neurological impairment: voice breaks, abrupt pauses, and the occasional faltering pronunciation caused by Mercury's assault on her vocal cords. In essence, every facet of her daily existence, from the angle of a candle to the proximity of bodyguards, was calibrated to uphold the illusion of radiant health. As the chemical onslaught took its toll, even basic functions became Herculean tasks. Gilbert's journal records a particularly grim entry. The Queen, he noted, was so unable to move her lips that she required a long straw to sip a simple fruit concoction. Each swallow emitted an audible rasp, as though her larynx, corroded by mercury, twisted beneath the surface. A few weeks prior to her final collapse, she was all but mute, reliant on the slightest quiver of an eyebrow or the faintest gesture of a gloved hand to convey her will. The Queen, who once rallied troops with a commanding speech, now depended on pantomime, caught in a tragic reversal by her own hand. In the hush that enveloped Whitehall during those waning days, one might imagine Elizabeth surrounded by relics of her storied past, a tapestry of state gifts on the far wall, the hush of velvet drapes, the glimmer of jeweled buttons on her gown. Yet beneath this veneer of splendor lay the quiet hum of chemical bonds at work. Each morning's ritual of ceruse and cinnabar had fortified her flesh against decay, even as it corroded her capacity to speak, to taste, and to feel. In the end, she had achieved the semblance of timeless beauty, preserved in a living sarcophagus of her own making, only to discover that perfection exacted a price too high for any mortal to bear. In Elizabeth's final moments, those who tended her described a sight both haunting and surreal: as if death had transformed her living form into a waxwork effigy. Her skin lay pale and luminous, stretched taut over her bones with an unearthly smoothness that betrayed no hint of the suffering she had endured. In his journal, William Gilbert recorded his astonishment upon examining her remains several hours after her passing. He noted that the natural angles of her face, her defined jawline, the prominent hollows beneath her cheeks, had not softened in death, as one might expect. Instead, he suspected that the accumulated layers of lead-based ceruse and cinnabar lip stain, now crystallized within her tissues, had formed a dense preservative shell that effectively sealed in decomposition gases. According to the oft-repeated account of Elizabeth Southwell, one of her ladies-in-waiting, this very accumulation of toxic vapors ultimately caused a sudden, violent rupture within the sealed coffin, heard as a sharp crack that split the wood and velvet lining. Whether or not the explosion truly occurred, the legend persists because contemporaries recognized that there was something fundamentally unnatural about the condition of Elizabeth's corpse. Elizabeth's death thus closed one chapter of Tudor history and opened another in the annals of medical tragedy. She became perhaps the earliest documented case of chronic heavy metal poisoning resulting from cosmetic use, a cautionary exemplar of the unforeseen perils of untested beauty preparations. The elaborate process of her living embalming applied unknowingly each morning when she layered lead and mercury onto her skin produced a de facto preservation method that would later intrigue forensic pathologists. Her body, encased in lead-lined coffers and doused in aromatic unguents, provided a kind of time capsule preserving the biochemical markers of chronic toxicity. In the centuries that followed, researchers recognized that analyses of her remains could yield invaluable data on the mechanisms by which lead and mercury disrupt neural function, degrade connective tissue, and impair systemic immunity. The chemical embalming that once concealed her ailments evolved into a potential treasure trove for modern forensic science. Yet this trove has remained frustratingly out of reach. Since the relocation of Elizabeth's remains to the Lady Chapel at Westminster Abbey in the year 1606, her tomb has never been opened. 19th and 20th century efforts to peer into her sarcophagus met only with impenetrable lead, yielding no biological samples beyond that thick metallic shell. The precise concentration of lead and residual mercury within the coffin's interior remains a mystery, thwarting any hope of reconstructing her true physiological state. As a result, the quest to recreate the real face of Elizabeth I, unmasked by centuries of legend, remains tantalizingly distant, a scholarly dream deferred by layers of wax, metal, and ritual. At its core, Elizabeth's story underscores the profound interdependence of image and power. She wielded her appearance as a political instrument, issuing decrees on court attire to enforce her authority, and deploying her radiant likeness to intimidate dissenters and rally supporters alike. Her famously opulent portraiture, commissioned across Europe, served not merely as flattering homage, but as statecraft in pigment and canvas, broadcasting her control over both body and realm. Yet that same instrument of power ultimately betrayed her. The very substances she embraced to project an unassailable visage allowed poison to seep into her marrow, undermining her health and, in time, her sovereignty. For historians, disentangling the strands of myth and historical fact presents an enduring challenge. Diplomatic reports from French and Spanish ambassadors, often penned in the privacy of their royal archives, appear more candid than the official English accounts, detailing her prolonged beauty rituals, the telltale staining of her fingertips, and the tremors in her hands during final audiences. Yet these foreign dispatches, while valuable, cannot alone resolve the full picture, for they too derive from second-hand observation, and may reflect their own court's biases. Meanwhile, the disappearance of key evidence embalming tools, personal letters, and medical annotations only deepens the mystery, fostering a historiographical gap that fuels speculation and conspiracy theories. What did Arthur Stanley truly find when he glimpsed that velvet-wrapped coffin? What secrets lie hidden in the walls of Westminster Abbey? And above all, to what extent did Elizabeth's pursuit of beauty seal her fate? In the silent hush of her tomb, the question lingers. Was Elizabeth I a pioneering martyr to a toxic vanity, or a tragic victim of misinterpreted maladies and a court culture obsessed with appearance? Without access to her remains, Scholars can only piece together clues from dusty archives and fractured narratives. Yet perhaps that uncertainty is part of her enduring legacy that a queen, who commanded armies and inspired a nation, should in death remain as elusive as the shimmering visage she so carefully crafted in life. As candlelight flickers in the abbey's vaulted ceilings, one might almost imagine Elizabeth's ghost, still poised before her gilded mirrors, caught between the realms of power and illusion, a reminder that the most potent forces can be those we carry beneath our own skin. For more than 4 centuries, scholars have wrestled with the task of restoring the truth about Elizabeth I. Was she genuinely poisoned to her marrow by the very cosmetics she so ardently applied? Or was she an unwitting victim of historical embellishment? In an age when modern regulators strictly limit lead and mercury in beauty products, the Tudor narrative serves as a cautionary echo, reminding us that safety standards we take for granted today were once non-existent. The dramatic suggestion that Elizabeth's lavish use of ceruse and cinnabar created a mortal hazard seems almost prophetic, yet it emerged at a time when power and image were inseparable, and any whiff of scandal could topple courts. Arthur Stanley's unexpected glimpse into the Queen's tomb during the 19th century further fueled intrigue. He reported finding, alongside the lead-lined sarcophagus, boxes of medical implements, glass test tubes, vials of mysterious liquids, and metal instruments likely remnants of contemporary embalming or toxicological assays. These artifacts, he noted in his private correspondence, vanished from the Abbey archives before any official record could catalogue them. Their disappearance, during later unannounced inspections of the crypt in 1953 and 1978, cast a shadow over the integrity of the ecclesiastical archive. Some historians speculate that political actors, determined to preserve Elizabeth's flawless image, may have deliberately removed incriminating evidence, objects that could confirm the extent of her chemical preservation and, by extension, the severity of her poisoning. The funeral itself became the stage for a final, grand illusion. The wooden effigy on the coffin, lavishly adorned with pearls, ermine, and the regalia of state, presented a visage of unblemished youth. It was a captivating contrast to the whispered rumours of a coffin that had exploded in a hissing rush of decompositional gas, a phenomenon many attributed to the trapped vapours rising from a body steeped in lead and mercury. Though no official chronicle records the sound, the anecdote became part of Tudor lore, passed among servants and pages in hurried confidences. The notion of toxic breath, lurking beneath moistened velvet and rotting wood, spoke to contemporaries of a secret too terrible for public gaze, that beneath the splendour lay a web of decay held at bay only by artifice. From Elizabeth's story, we draw a stark lesson about the performing of public identity, how carefully it may be choreographed to conceal a harsher reality. The Queen's skillful use of cosmetics and portraiture taught the Tudor court that power could be sustained through illusion. Yet her reliance on that facade woven of lead, mercury, and painter's pigment ultimately exacted a tragic price: the corrosion of body and trust. Her subjects may have adored the radiant mirage, but they remained unaware of the slow unravelling at her core. Even now, many questions linger unanswered. What were the precise concentrations of lead and mercury within her remains? Did the coffin truly rupture under internal gas pressure, or is that but a poetic flourish? And who quietly removed the supposedly lost artifacts? A collusion of church officials, royal archivists, or unrecorded court factions determined to protect the myth? Each piece of vanished evidence deepens the rift between legend and fact, ensuring that Elizabeth's life remains a subject of fascination for historians, toxicologists, and artists alike. Ultimately, the life of Elizabeth I stands as a timeless testament to the inseparable bond between beauty, power, and its hidden costs. She enforced dress codes to project authority, commissioned portraits to broadcast strength, and applied layers of lethal cosmetics to uphold her image. Her legacy warns us that when outward perfection becomes paramount, the substance that lies beneath may yield its own perilous narrative, one that echoes through centuries as a reminder of how fragile human endeavour truly is. At the close of her remarkable reign, Elizabeth I stood as a figure of profound duality, lauded as the foremost Queen of England, her diplomatic triumphs and political acumen celebrated across Europe, yet secretly ensnared by a vanity that would ultimately betray her. In her own words, she professed to possess the body of a weak and feeble woman, yet claimed the heart and stomach of a king. This self-avowal of inner steadfastness belied the reality of a body steeped in poisonous cosmetics, lead-laden ceruse and mercury-rich cinnabar that corroded her flesh from within. The tension between her lofty self-image and her chemically compromised body has become a stark moral lesson, reminding posterity of the frailty inherent in human ambition and the perils of excessive concern for appearance. Guild records from the Worshipful Company of Carpenters provide chilling corroboration of the lengths to which Elizabeth's court would go to control the narrative of her death. Thomas Whitmore, the master carpenter commissioned to construct her final coffin, noted in his private journal that he was instructed to line the coffin with lead nearly twice as thick as any prior royal interment. He fitted the lid with specialized seals and built internal compartments to ensure airtight preservation. Such over-engineering, Whitmore wrote, seemed less a tribute to majesty, and more the design of a guardian, tasked with containing some hidden horror. These meticulous specifications underscore the vast network of information management that sustained the Queen's legend even beyond the grave. Equally telling is the mysterious disappearance of medical artifacts first observed by Dean Arthur Penrhyn Stanley during his brief Victorian inspection of the tomb. Stanley reported finding glass vials and specialized surgical tools likely used in the embalming process or possibly for rudimentary toxicological experiments. Subsequent unannounced audits of the crypt in 1953 and 1978 recovered nothing but the impenetrable shell of lead. The vanishing of those instruments, scholars like James Whitfield argue, was no accident but part of a deliberate purge of inconvenient royal health records during the 19th century. Whitfield's research suggests that materials documenting the Queen's sickness were systematically excised from official chronicles, ensuring that the immortal image of Elizabeth remained untarnished by the spectre of her own poisoned flesh. Perhaps the most tragic aspect of Elizabeth's final years was her profound isolation. In her obsessive pursuit to conceal every flaw, she severed the very connections that once energized her rule. State policies, declarations of war, and the pomp of royal ceremonies were repeatedly postponed or reconfigured around her demanding makeup schedule and mounting physical limitations. Those who served her ministers, courtiers, and even foreign ambassadors spoke of long silences and choreographed audiences held behind silken screens. The Queen, who once convened the Privy Council with commanding presence, now convened meetings through intermediaries, her voice and visage mediated by layers of artifice. In our own era, Elizabeth's story resonates with uncanny clarity. The modern imperative for perfect image on social media echoes the unreal standards of Tudor courtly appearance. Just as Elizabeth invested hours each morning applying ceruse and cinnabar, so too do we now spend digital lifetimes curating online personas, editing, filtering, and retouching to preserve an illusion of unblemished perfection. And, as then, we risk losing touch with our authentic selves, sacrificing health and emotional well-being in exchange for the fragile currency of approval. Elizabeth's fate warns us that an obsession with image can become no less imprisoning than the gilded court venues she once commanded. Yet for all the technological distance between her world and ours, many mysteries of her reign remain stubbornly unresolved. We cannot open her coffin to measure residual lead levels, to sample bone tissue for mercury content, or to verify whether that fabled explosion of decomposition gas truly occurred. We rely instead on scattered archival fragments, the Carpentry Guild ledgers, Gilbert's medical journal, and the candid dispatches of French and Spanish envoys. These sources, imperfect yet invaluable, coalesce into a portrait of a queen whose final triumph, her preserved, lifelike effigy atop the casket, was achieved at the cost of her own body and dignity. In the hush of Westminster Abbey, beneath the vaulted ceilings and in the shadows of historical memory, Elizabeth's lead-lined tomb remains sealed. Its silence is almost eloquent, a testament to the enduring power of image and the lengths to which those in authority will go to guard it. Her legacy endures as both inspiration and caution, a reminder that human endeavor, no matter how brilliant, can be undone by the hidden chemicals of vanity. And so, we continue to piece together her story, honoring the Queen who ruled an empire, while warning ourselves of the fragile bargain we strike whenever we yield our bodies to the pursuit of eternal perfection. 4 decades after her passing, Elizabeth I continues to enthrall generations of scholars, forensic scientists, and historians. each wielding their own instruments, autopsy scalpels, chemical assays, archival research to unearth her secrets. It is tempting to believe that only her lead-lined sarcophagus holds the key to the truth of her demise. Yet in reality, it is Elizabeth's own deliberate acts, the procurement of vast quantities of lead and mercury pigments, her strict directives to isolate herself, her final edict forbidding any post-mortem examination that constitute the most damning evidence of her paradoxical fate. Each order written in the treasurer's ledgers, each private memorandum to her physician, and each entry in her court's minutes collectively indict her pursuit of a flawless facade at the expense of natural law and personal well-being. Her story resonates as a stark reminder that, even endowed with supreme authority and storied beauty, a human remains powerless when confronting the immutable principles of biology and chemistry. Elizabeth marshaled the resources of her realm to sustain the illusion of perpetual youth. She stocked gold tins of Venetian ceruse, bottled cinnabar lip stains, and commissioned wardrobes of velvet to conceal a frail body beneath regal trappings. She positioned bodyguards and layers of courtiers to guard her image, and she instituted a taboo against autopsy that shrouded her final hours in silence. Yet, as the years progressed, the dream she so carefully nurtured began to unravel her vitality, sapped by the very compounds that promised to immortalize her visage, her voice stilled by the neurotoxic assault of lead and mercury, and her flesh preserved in a coffin thicker with lead than any that had come before. At her death, the trappings of monarchy fell away to reveal a queen stripped bare by her own vanity. The grand procession, the lifelike wooden effigy, the 3-week vigil beside a sealed, zinc-lined coffin, they all served one ultimate purpose: to mask the decaying reality beneath the varnished pomp. But as the coffin was closed, so too were the doors to direct inquiry. In the decades and centuries that followed, each attempt to pry open that leaden vault was thwarted. Ecclesiastical statutes prevailed over scientific curiosity, tradition over transparency. The result is a prison of silence, in which the physical remains and the documentary evidence are both walled off from modern scrutiny. Thus, until the day her tomb is finally opened, every argument, hypothesis, and revelation remains an incomplete puzzle piece. We sift through James Whitfield's analysis of 19th-century archival purges. We pore over the surviving diplomatic dispatches that speak candidly of staining fingertips and trembling hands, and we examine the fragments of William Gilbert's medical notes that chronicle her descent into a poisoned oblivion. Yet without direct access to tissue samples, bone assays, or even residue from her embalming compounds, our picture of Elizabeth's last days remains fragmentary, a mosaic of whispers and shadows. Elizabeth I endures as a symbol of the unseen costs behind a shining legacy. Beneath the dazzling portraits and the celebrated speeches lies the quiet testimony of a body compromised by its own adornment. In the hush of Westminster Abbey, her sealed coffin stands as both monument and admonition, that the pursuit of perfection, no matter how exalted, may exact a price beyond our reckoning. And so, we remember her not only as the Virgin Queen who led a nation through tempest and triumph, but as a woman whose final secrets lie entombed in lead and mercury. They await the day when truth, long buried in the cold confines of ritual and reverence, will finally emerge, reminding us that history's most enduring mysteries often dwell in the spaces between light and shadow, waiting for the patient hand of discovery to draw them into view. And so, as we gently close the heavy tome of Elizabeth's life and lay to rest the echoes of her whispered secrets, let us ease our minds into the quiet softness of night. Imagine, if you will, the candlelight flickering low in a vaulted chamber of ancient stone, its glow gradually dimming until only the gentlest warmth remains, like the final ember of a hearth that has burned through its last log. In this hush, the grandeur of courtly splendor and the weight of poisoned beauty slip away, leaving only the simple, human truths that lie beneath. That even the greatest among us walk a fragile line between aspiration and overreach, and that the pursuit of perfection, however noble in intention, can sometimes bind us more tightly than any chain. Let your thoughts drift now toward the serene understanding that our worth is measured less by outward shine and more by the quiet integrity of our hearts. In Elizabeth's story, we find both triumph and caution. The triumph of a sovereign who steered her nation through stormy seas, and the cautionary reminder that no crown, no matter how jeweled, can shield us from the consequences of vanity unchecked. May this reflection settle deep within you, like a gentle tide, smoothing the jagged edges of ambition and inviting a softer rhythm to guide your dreams. As the final wisp of firelight fades into the welcoming embrace of darkness, allow yourself to feel reassured that truth, though sometimes buried beneath layers of artifice and legend, remains ever present, waiting to be uncovered, piece by careful piece, by those with patience and compassion. Take comfort in knowing that each of us, in our own small way, contributes to the tapestry of history with our choices, our kindnesses, and the quiet courage we show when we dare to be authentically ourselves. And now, dear listener, as your eyelids grow heavy and the world outside slips further into slumber, let the soft cadence of these words linger like a lullaby in your mind. That power wrought through empathy and respect outshines any throne built on illusion, and that the truest legacy we leave is woven from the gentle threads of honesty and grace. Sleep well, and may your dreams be sweet reflections of your own unguarded beauty. If you have found peace in this tale and wish to wander further into the quiet corners of history with us, please subscribe to our channel, where new stories await, stories that illuminate, console, and inspire, whispered softly into the night. Good night, and rest easy.